He's great. Lee and Brian.
Good. Yeah. I haven't said yet.
Oh, what?
Yes, me.
We'll see how long.
Well, I mean, he has so many options, he doesn't even know. I think there's some like Apple, Google, Nvidia, TikTok, and Facebook. I don't know. Yeah, he's blowing up.
You guys want to say anything to Silvia?
Oh.
Whose defense are we at again? Why are we here?
Hi, Silvia.
I got here early.
Good job, Silvia.
Wish her retroactive good luck when she sees this.
Should we say break a leg? I don't know.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Great job, by the way. You did awesome.
You were great. Loved it.
They run, and I'm like, all right.
Yeah. He runs.
Oh.
Steve is a sick but he's going he was kind of blindsided. You would never told him. But he's now excited that that's going to happen.
I know this isn't the stressfulest thing that's happened.
And when you get
Good luck.
The back.
I figured you were trying to be out of your
Yeah, no, that's funny. And that creates funny.
I'm like, you know,
You're those robot things.
what is that?
Yeah, no, it's nice to
Okay, I think we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming. I'm obviously going to introduce Dr. Silvia Lopez Guzman, who is a graduate student in my group. Sylvia, this is Sylvia not with her beloved Lola. As some of you know, Sylvia abandoned a perfectly good career as a physician to join us here. She was an academic physician in Columbia. Now, most people think that means this place. Is this not the best picture? But I want to stress to you that this is not the Columbia she came to us from. You can tell that because it's spelled differently. This is the Columbia she came to us from. So this is a better picture of little Sylvia than the one I just showed you. So in any case, so she was a successful academic physician in Columbia with good career. She was teaching, and she had this crazy idea that if she was going to rise to lead the medical school she worked in, past tense, she would need a PhD. And to get a PhD in something she was really interested in, she had to leave Columbia. And so she applied for a Fulbright to come to the United States and study at one of the great institutions. She wound up with us in the United States. And this is the look on her face, I gather, when she got her Fulbright. It's awesome. It's awesome.
Oh my God.
So Silvia then left Bogota to come here, get her PhD. When she joined my lab, she was interested in pain and addiction, in neurology, and she had a very clear plan, which was to get a PhD as quickly as she could and go back to Bogota, which was an interesting experience for me in the sense that she was a graduate student who was, by any reasonable standard, a postdoc, because she had already completed her advanced degree, she had experience teaching, she was a lecturer, and here she was now a first-year graduate student, which a transition she carried off with tremendous grace. Okay, so her plan was to go back as quickly as she could. It didn't actually work out that way. She's finished quite quickly, as you'll see, and the work she's done is quite brilliant. But she, while here, met the two great loves of her life. Her cat, Corey. Oh, no, wait. And her husband, Lola. And as you may know, though, the terms of her Fulbright do require her to return to Columbia for a while. She has really changed her career plans and is now very much focused on sort of R1 academic career, probably in the United States or in Europe. And there are many, many different career paths, and all of them are equally good. It's interesting to me to see a transition. We often see the transition in the other direction, not in this one, so that's kind of interesting. Sylvia, while she's here, has had a lot of crazy experiences, so I'm showing this one picture. Jan can't be here today. This is a picture from Jan's roof of all of them at the eclipse, and it's actually taken by a drone. And this is kind of, I think this is the image of my lab, with like people standing on the roof looking at the sun going black, and someone driving a drone. Okay, before I tell you about her work, I'm just going to show one more picture. So this is a sort of typical day in our lab. You can see Sylvia on the left. Everybody looks really happy. You'll notice I don't look so happy, and that's because this is as we're sort of discussing Sylvia getting ready to go back to Columbia. And so I want to use that as a transition to say that these things are always bittersweet. As you will see, and I don't really need to tell you much about her work because she will, her work is a brilliant mix of neuroeconomics, computational science, clinical science, with really, really strong potential to impact the opioid epidemic. It has really grabbed the interest of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, both in the terms of funding. It's had the attention of the director herself, Nora Folkow, who some of you know, is very, very anxious for Sylvia's work to be brought into a more developed application that can be used in the clinic and field tested as a tool for improving compliance during opioid treatment. John and I are going to try and help skipper that through for her. So the work is really impactful, and it's really where I think the rubber meets the road for neuroscience. I could not be prouder, and I could not be sadder to be here today. Assuming she doesn't screw up catastrophically in the next 3 hours. Of course, you're all, no pressure. You're all invited to our lab towards the end of the day, and we'll send out an email to that effect, assuming she doesn't do anything to embarrass all of us. Okay, let's tell you.
Not good.
All right, so
tradition in this department to start off with a very gentle banter. No, something funny about your advisor. Paul had his fun already, so I feel like I should just do the same for a few seconds. I just want you all, I want to introduce you to the fast-paced life in the Glimcher Lab. Paul is a very, very busy man, so interactions with him are often very short and fast, and he wants to give you the maximum amount of feedback on the shortest amount of time possible. And so I made this video a while ago to show you how that goes down. This is one interaction where I brought him a figure that I had made, and I was asking him for feedback. And so you'll see the figure at the beginning and the figure at the end after his feedback. And the video is not very great quality. Paul's voice is a little distorted, and it's back when he was wearing his hair long. I don't know. So hopefully this is working.
This is on the right track, but I think we need more of a classic feel to fit the brand. Lose that, move this up there, circle that, move this here, that there, these up top, these underneath, and then flip it. Got it?
You got it.
Good. Then circle that, put that up there, move that, this and that, these and those, that and that, all of this, and that.
No, but in all seriousness, it's been great working with Paul. I'll take some time at the end to thank him again and everybody at the lab. But now I do want to transition from this lighthearted topic to a little bit more of a serious topic. So as Paul mentioned, most of my work has focused on deploying tools from neuroeconomics to tackle a problem that we have in this nation right now. And that's the fact that more people die now from drug overdoses than other causes of accidental death, like car accidents or gunshot wounds. And so what I'm showing you here is the number of deaths in thousands from drug overdoses since 1999. This is for cocaine and benzodiazepines. But as you can see, the rate of increase of death from opioid overdoses is staggering. It's exponential. And last year, 2016, we reached more deaths from drug overdoses than the peak mortality during the HIV epidemic. So this is, by any measure, a real epidemic. Another way to show you that is that this is no longer a geographically circumscribed problem. People are dying everywhere where there are people in this country. So this is a very, very serious matter. Now, the good news is that there is treatment, and that treatment can save lives. It's called medication-assisted treatment, and it's a combination of an opioid substitute and cognitive and psychosocial therapy. And it works. The medications are safe when they're taken as prescribed. They serve to reduce drug use, to reduce mortality, to reduce comorbidity by infectious diseases, and in general, it improves social function and quality of life. But there are limitations to it. First of all, it's not available everywhere. So there's huge inequality. Here I'm showing you a map of the United States with the rate of opioid use disorder per state. And the size of the yellow dots indicates the treatment capacity. So as you can see, it differs a lot from state to state. And if you were to break it down by county, the inequality would be even worse. So there are challenges to that. First, I mentioned the shortage of availability. Another huge problem is relapse. And so relapse is a problem for any substance use disorder. But for opioids, it's quite severe. Most people consider detox kind of like the main sort of treatment, even though it's not as effective as aftercare, as MAT. And this study right here from 2013 showed that after leaving detoxification, which is just a short run of time when subjects are guided through abstinence until they're symptom-free. A third of them returned to opioid use the same day. 65% of them within the month, and almost all of them had returned to opioid use within a year. Now, the rates with MAT are lower, but they still hover around 40 to 50% within six months. So these are the two challenges. So how do we respond to the challenges? Well, for starters, if relapse is a problem, we need to understand the mechanisms behind relapse. And then we can perhaps deploy that knowledge and develop tools that can allow us to predict when relapse is about to happen so that we can intervene and prevent it. And maybe if we do that in a personalized way, right, we can target the resources to the individuals that need them the most at the time that they need them the most, and that way we can relieve some of the pressure that we have from the limited MAT availability. All right, so these two things are really just one, developing some sort of individual-based prediction of relapse. And so relapses kind of exist within this vicious cycle of addiction where people go from using drugs to stopping use, going into withdrawal, generating or experiencing negative affect, and then moving towards a period of preoccupation and anticipation, obsessing with drug use and experiencing craving, and finally succumbing to consumption and perhaps binge. But at the center of this cycle, there is a choice, or at least a series of choices, which is why decision-making is key to studying relapse. And so we can leverage the tools that we have from neuroeconomics that provide us computational models that characterize an individual's decision-making and give us individual-based parameters that we perhaps can use as tools for prediction. And this is broadly encased within the sort of like core philosophy of this new field of computational psychiatry, where the idea is that we can use mathematical models that can help us bridge what we know from neurobiology with the clinical problems that we have. And in this case, these mathematical models are models of cognitive processes, but they need not be. All right, and so I'm going to focus for the rest of the talk in two main dimensions of value-based decision-making: impulsive decision-making and risky decision-making, which are relevant for addiction and relapse. And so the plan for today is I'm going to first tell you some work that I've done trying to find and refine the right tools for clinical prediction. And more specifically, I'm going to be talking about how to disentangle computational parameters for impulsive decision-making and risky decision-making. And then I'm going to tell you about work that we've been doing to really deploy these computational tools to try in the clinic to try to predict when individuals are about to use drugs and maybe relapse. And finally, I'm going to touch on some more recent work that I've started doing, trying to uncover what the neural mechanism behind this is. All right, so let's get started with talking about how to separate or disentangle computational parameters for impulsive and risky decision-making. So impulsivity and risk are two constructs that are widely studied in psychiatry and psychology. And we could more or less arbitrarily locate in the space spanned by these two dimensions different disorders. So for instance, we could put substance use disorder here, high impulsivity, high risk, maybe anorexia nervosa here, some intermediate level of risk, low impulsivity, or even pathological self-control even. But regardless of what we're studying and whether we want to do this, this only works if these two dimensions are distinguishable, right? But there are potential compounds, or potential factors that can get them entangled. For instance, we think about impulsive behavior and impulsive decision-making as someone who is willing to forfeit future outcomes for immediate ones. But the future is inherently uncertain, right? And what if I'm behaving in a way that appears to be impulsive because I'm preferably selecting the more immediate outcomes, but it's because I'm averse to risk. I hate risk. So that kind of mixes these two. So one way to get to the disentanglement is to operationalize this. And so we can operationalize computational impulsivity or impulsive decision making by using temporal discounting. So what I'm showing you here is a series of discount functions. And these are functions that are showing you how a reward loses value, subjective value, SV, as a function of the delay to its delivery. And this can be formulated using different models. This is a pretty prevalent model developed by, or proposed by Mazur in the 80s. Hyperbolic discounting model is pervasive in the psychology literature, where the discounted subjective value of a reward is equal to V, its value, divided by D, the delay to its delivery, and scaled by a parameter kappa, the discount rate, or K, whatever you want to call it. And obviously, the higher the K, the steeper this function, the more impulsive the decision maker. Okay, what about risk? So we can also operationalize risk. In economics, an individual's risk preference is equivalent to the curvature of this function here, the utility function, which is a function that maps the objective value of a reward or an outcome with its subjective value, right? And we can, again, propose to operationalize, or it's been proposed to be formulated in this way, where the subjective value of an outcome is equal to the probability of that outcome times the value to an exponent alpha. So when that exponent is equal to 1, alpha equals 1, the decision maker is risk neutral, and the mapping is linear between the objective value and the subjective value. When alpha is less than 1, the individual is risk averse, the decision maker is risk averse, and this function is concave. And when alpha is higher than 1, the individual is risk seeking, and this function is convex. So, the utility function need not be neutral. In fact, most studies show that most people are not risk neutral in their decision making. But note that that is not incorporated in this model at all. Let's say that D was equal to 0. If D were equal to 0, then the discounted subjective value would equal the value, right? And so that would assume that alpha equals 1. So we posited the hypothesis that maybe standard approaches of measuring the discount rate in that way that I just showed you, without accounting for risk preference, could be distorting its estimation. And so to test this hypothesis, we set out to compare different models of discounting. So here's this very pervasive model in the psychology literature I mentioned, the hyperbolic discounting model, that is discounting value. And we propose to compare it against a model that preserves that functional form, but it's discounting subjective value rather than value, this subjective value that I just talked about here. And for completeness, we also propose to test this exponential discounting model that's more common in the econ literature. But again, this exponential model is discounting on value, on V. And we propose to test it against its equivalent exponential model with subjective value instead of. All right, so here's the 2x2 matrix of of the models that I plan to compare. So 2 forms, hyperbolic, exponential. And for the rest of the talk, I'm going to refer to standard as the models that are in the literature that discount on value, and extended, the equivalent functional forms, but that discount on subjective value. Okay, so to do this, we had participants come in and complete 2 decision-making tasks. One that we're going to use to estimate the alpha parameter, the risk preference parameter, and one that we're going to use for the discount rate, impulsivity parameter. So in the first task, subjects are asked to choose between a $5 shore game and playing a lottery. And this display, we told our subjects to think of it as a bag of 100 chips, poker chips. Some were red, some were blue, and this indicates what the distribution is. So 50 chips are red, 50 chips are blue. And playing the lottery involves putting your hand in the bag blindly and pulling out a chip at random. So your chances of getting a red chip would be 50%. Your chances of getting a blue would be 50%. If you got a red one, you would get $28. If you got a blue one, you would get $0. And it was always between 0 and some amount. So we're asking them to choose between playing that lottery and getting a sure gain of $5. So they have some time to decide, a few seconds, then there's a queue to respond. They enter their response, they get a confirmation of what they chose. There's a variable ITI, and then we move on to the next trial. And this is just to show you that across trials we counterbalance the color that was the winning color. Okay, so for the other task, this is a standard intertemporal choice task. We asked our subjects to choose between two monetary gains, one that will be delivered today, and the other one that would be delivered with some delay. And so from trial to trial, we switch, we change the number of days and the amount. Again, they have some time to decide. There's a queue to respond. They get a confirmation, and then move on to the next trial. So we did this, and we also counterbalanced the order of the tasks across sessions and across subjects. So we had 39 otherwise healthy volunteers, and who came and did 2 sessions for each subject. And I just want to note that the values of the rewards were very similar. The range was very similar across both tasks. The risk task had 3 levels of probability, 25, 50%, and 75%. And the intertemporal choice task had delays that went from 0 to 150. Importantly, this is all played out for real. So subjects at the end of a session, we randomly select from one of the trials from one of the tasks one trial, and we pay them according to their choices. And we did this using a mechanism where we would send them a text message with a code for a money order pickup, which was important because that way we could equalize the transaction costs across any type of payment. All right. So let me start by telling you that we find that risk preferences are quite diverse. I'm showing you here the distribution of the natural logarithm of alpha, the risk attitude parameter. And so what you can see right off the bat, alpha equal 1 would be log of alpha equal 0. And as you can see, that's where risk neutrality would be. The distribution is not centered around alpha equal 1. So the assumption that people are risk neutral is incorrect. And just as other people have reported before, the distribution is shifted to the left. So most people are risk averse, fairly risk averse. Okay, so that gave us even more confirmation that perhaps it's important to take this diversity into account. So we went ahead and started comparing our models. And so that's what I'm showing you here. I'm showing you the goodness of fit for the models computed as the cross-validated log likelihood. On the x-axis, I have the standard model, and on the y-axis, I have the extended model on its hyperbolic version on the left side and exponential version on the right side. And as you can see, for both models, our extended model performed better. So each of these dots is a session, regardless of the function. Then we also compared the 2 extended models, hyperbolic versus exponential form. And now, interestingly, we find that there's no significant difference. Here in this last panel, I'm just showing you the average log likelihood difference for each of the 3 comparisons. And you can see that it's significantly different for this one and this one, but it's not significantly different for this last comparison. Okay, so that was interesting. We find that there is an advantage to using an extended model approach. But the other question that is not just about performance, is about discriminability. So to do that, we did a model recovery analysis. And basically what this entails is generating data sets from each of the models, of the 4 models, that these are the true models, the generative models, and then fitting all the models to each of the data sets. And I'm showing you here the difference in AIC score between the true model and the model that was fitted. And so warmer colors is smaller difference between the true model and the model that was used. Obviously, there's 0 across the diagonal, but what should be obvious from this is that there's a lot of yellow everywhere, which is bad because it means that most models are very flexible and they'll fit anything, except for this one model. Our extended hyperbolic model seems to be pretty discriminable. It only fits data well when it's coming from itself. So we consider this, that this is indication that this is the preferable model. And so now that we have a winning model, we went and looked at what the difference in estimates is from the traditional approach to our new kind of better approach. And so to do this, we again simulated data using our extended hyperbolic model. And what I'm plotting here is the difference in the discount rate estimate from the standard model, standard hyperbolic, and our extended hyperbolic as a function of the risk attitude value. And so what you see is that when the decision maker is risk-seeking, its alpha parameter is higher than 1, the standard approach underestimates the discount rate. And when the decision maker is risk-averse, the standard approach overestimates the discount rate. This means that when you have a risk-seeking individual, you're going to assume that they're less impulsive than they really are, and when you have a risk-averse individual, which is very common, you're going to assume that they're more impulsive than they really are. And that's what we see in our data. Okay, so interestingly, or like obviously, rather, when alpha equals 1, the two models converge to the same model, to the same functional form. But I've told you that our extended hyperbolic model is better. So what you would expect is that as you're moving from alpha equal 1 in either direction, that's where our model should really shine. And that's what I'm showing you here. So I'm collapsing along the two directions away from alpha equal 1. So this is distance from risk neutrality. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you our extended model advantage in terms of cross-validated log likelihood. And as you can see, as we're moving away from risk neutrality, we see what we expect, that there's a significant increasing advantage of using our approach. Okay, so I started talking about how it would be maybe useful to study these two dimensions of decision-making in the context of psychiatry and psychology. And I told you that this would only be possible if these two are really different and orthogonal, right? And now I'm going to show you that with the standard hyperbolic approach, again, this is the model that is pervasive in the literature. Hundreds and hundreds of studies get published every year using this model. We have a negative correlation between the discount rate and the risk attitude parameter. So you often assume that people who are high on impulsivity are low on risk. Whereas with our extended hyperbolic, we achieve a decorrelation of these two parameters. And that's really what you want. Because that way, they're reflecting two independent dimensions of decision making. Okay, so to conclude this first part, we found that our extended model of discounting performs better. That measuring the discount rate without using this approach leads to systematic bias, and this is dangerous because it can lead to misinterpretations of your data where you think that you're seeing differences in impulsivity and really you're seeing differences in risk. And finally, our approach results in a meaningful decorrelation of these two computational parameters. All right, so now that we've refined our approach, we can now launch it and see how well it does in terms of clinical prediction. And we have done some work with my collaborator, Anna, looking at impulsivity and looking at risk. In the interest of time today, I'm only going to tell you the story about computational impulsivity. And if you're curious about the result with risk, I'm happy to talk about it later. Okay, so what we want to try to see is whether impulsive decision-making is predictive of opioid use and relapse during treatment for opioid use disorder. So this comes out of the very clear observation that substance users exhibit higher discount rates than controls. This is taken from a meta-analysis. Each of these things is a study, and as you can see, this is across different substances of abuse and across studies, they find consistently that the discount rates are higher. Perhaps more interestingly, some work coming out of Warren Bickel's lab has suggested that discount rates might be plastic in patients with opioid use disorder, and they might be responding in some way to treatment. Here, I'm replotting some data from his paper. This is what the average discount function would be for healthy control groups. This is what they report as the average discount rate for this group of opioid use dependent patients, disorder patients at the beginning of MAP, and this is after 12 weeks. So they take this to indicate that this is a signature of self-control repair, and that MAT somehow is working and is making them less impulsive than they were at the beginning. So this is interesting but puzzling, because first of all, this study was conducted in the context of a clinical trial. So all the subjects who entered the study were going to be for 12 months in this trial. This is not the reality in MAT, right? Because people come into MAT, they sometimes drop out, they stay in MAT for sometimes years. During those years, they have periods of abstinence, but also they return to drug use in some cases, and sometimes there's a big relapse event and a big dropout, and they leave. So this is not very reflective of the reality. But it's interesting, because one could think that maybe this movement in this direction is a sign that they're moving towards abstinence, and conversely, that movement in the other direction of getting more impulsive could be perhaps indicative of them being at risk of relapse and about to go back to opioid use. And so that's the hypothesis that we posited, that discount rate fluctuations could be predicting abstinence if they were going in the direction of decreasing discount rate, or opioid use if they were going in the direction of increasing discount rate. And so to test this hypothesis, we conducted a large longitudinal study conducted at the clinic, the opioid treatment program in Bellevue Hospital. And we recruited 74 patients. OUD is short for opioid use disorder, who were about to begin MAT, roughly within the first four weeks. And we assessed them repeatedly over the course of the first 7 months of treatment. This is, again, if you remember, I told you that 40 to 60% of patients relapse within the first 6 months. So this period was chosen to sort of get to that critical period of danger. And we also followed a cohort of matched community controls, matched for age and gender, socioeconomic status, education, etc. All right, so we collected a lot of information on them. We collected what we call static predictors, static because we collected them only once, demographic information, cognitive personality, information about their medical and psychiatric history. And then at each of the sessions, we collected what we call dynamic predictors or dynamic variables, because we collected them at every time. So first, the decision-making behavior. This is going to be the intertemporal choice task or the temporal discounting task that I showed you at the beginning. We collected information about their symptomatology, so what their symptoms for craving, withdrawal, and anxiety was for each of their sessions. And we also recorded how compliant they were with their treatment plan. This is measured as the percentage of attendance to the clinic as they were supposed to, and getting their medication. And our outcome of interest is obviously drug use, which we assess by self-report, and then we cross-validate that information with their toxicology records in their clinical chart. So at the end, we obtained 608 sessions from our opioid use disorder group. So again, OUD means opioid use disorder. These are our patients. They're always going to be, for reference, in red for the rest of the talk, and 198 for the community controls in blue, CC. Community controls. Okay. So first, how do their discount rates behave? So as has been reported before, we do find a significant, this is, collapsing across time, just computing the mean of their discount rates across sessions, there is a significant difference in the discount rates between our two groups. So again, red is patients, blue is controls, and you can see that red is shifted to the right, so it's higher discount rate than controls. And this difference, again, is significant, but you note that there's quite a bit of overlap between these two distributions. Hopefully you can see the transparency. Okay, so that was interesting. Another thing that was important to check, at least we're reproducing what other people have seen before, another thing that was important to check was how reliable is the discount rate. Because the studies had not measured the discount rate so many times in patients before, and we wanted to see what the test-to-retest reliability level was. And so we computed that as the interclass correlation coefficient, and we see that they're, although different between the patients and controls, they're pretty good for both. 0.6, give or take, ICC is a pretty good test-retest reliability level. Okay, so now let's look at how discount rates are changing in time. And so what I'm showing you here is the trajectory of the discount rate for So on the x-axis, I have the sessions. Note that the spacing between the sessions is reflecting the spacing in time between them by design. And then on the y-axis, I have the log of the discount rate. And so there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of stuff happening there. To compare the trajectories with our patients, we can focus on the first 5 sessions for which we have data both from our patient group and our control group, and they're equally spaced in time. And again, so you see that in our patient group, again, there's quite a bit of variability across sessions, a lot of variability across individuals too. And in our controls, these trajectories seem to be flatter, although there's quite a bit of variability across subjects too. One big question, and one reason why we had our community control group, was whether or not there were consistent effects, practice effects of just repeating the task over and over. Again, this is not something that has been done in this way before. And so we find that there's no consistent effect of session or practice effects. Again, this is all, these are all checks that are important if you want to really use this as a clinical tool. All right, so now let's focus on the variability, because we've seen that these trajectories, at least visually, seem to be different. And so we can look at the variability. First, we can look at where they start off. And we see that patients and controls start off, their baseline discount rate, let's call this discount rate at study entry, is significantly different. So it's significantly higher in patients compared to controls. But again, a lot of overlap. We can also look at the variability across time as the slope of the discount rate over the days of the study. And we find here that there's no difference across the two groups. The slope is, for both groups is centered around 0, but there's quite a bit of variability across individuals from the groups. And then the final thing that we can look at is the session-to-session variability, so how it's wiggling in time. And we computed that as the coefficient of variation, the geometric coefficient of variation here, because we usually use our discount rates in log space. And we see that this is a significant difference. So patients are varying a lot more from session to session than controls. So this is interesting, but the question is, well, is this variability just noise, or is it clinically meaningful? Clinically meaningful. All right. And we see that it is. So what I'm showing you here is the correlation between the discount rate in our patient group and each of the different symptoms that we collected from session to session. So this is from session to session, and we see that there seems to be a consistent positive correlation between the discount rate and the level of craving. And we don't see that consistent correlation with any of the other symptoms. So this is very interesting because craving is a key symptom for addiction, and it's a key symptom for predicting relapse. I just told you that it's part of that vicious cycle that anticipates or comes before the decision to go back to drug use. So now we want to know, well, how are these two things contributing to the risk of going back to opioid use, and are they independent, given that they're correlated? And so we can leverage the design, the longitudinal design of our study, and we can look at whether we can detect negative events, negative toxicologies, or positive events, positive toxicologies. And importantly, I told you that we had 608 sessions, and out of this 608, 49.4% are opioid positive, so we do have good power to detect these events, and this is consistent with what we expected from the literature. All right, so the idea is that we're going to be doing a time-lagged prediction using the data that we collect on the previous session to predict what the drug use is going to be on the following session. And so the way that we're doing this is we're using a generalized linear mixed effects model. This is a model that allows us to account for the shared variance that's coming from multiple sessions from a same subject. And here I'm starting with just the clinical model. What I call the clinical model is just the withdrawal, anxiety, craving symptoms, and the adherence or compliance to treatment. And so we're modeling opioid use next week based on the previous week values for all of these. And what we find is that craving is a significant positive predictor of opioid use the following week. And adherence is a significant negative predictor, or lack of compliance is a significant predictor of opioid use. So the question now is, do we add anything by putting on our discount rate? And we find that the discount rate in the previous session does not predict opioid use. So this is the log of the discount rate in the previous session, and this is the log of the discount rate from the baseline, the first discount rate. So neither of these two things are predictive. So what does that mean? That means that there's no threshold level of discount rate that increases the odds of opioid use the following week. But I just showed you that there was a lot of variability across subjects and also a lot of variability from session to session. So it stands to reason that perhaps what is relevant is not the value, the threshold value, but perhaps the change, the relative change. And so that's what we computed here in what we call the full model. So here I'm computing the percent change in discount rate with regard to where the subject was in the session before that, predicting the following session. And what we see is that that percent change is a positive significant predictor. And it is even positive and predictive while accounting for the baseline level of discount rate. And these two things are correlated. So that's great. It seems like percent change or relative change in discounting is predictive. But then the following question is, well, is this adding anything to the variance that we're explaining with just the clinical predictors alone? And so we tested for that using a likelihood ratio test, and we find that the difference in the models is significant, and we're explaining about 5.4% more variance by using these, or adding these to our model. Okay, so the session-to-session variability, this variability that was different in patients and controls seems to be clinically relevant and is a proximal predictor of opioid use events. But here's an important thing that I should mention. Opioid use events can be isolated events. Patients can, as I said, while they're going through MAT, they can have one slip where they have a positive toxicology. But that does not mean that that's a relapse. A relapse event is a more coalesced, let's say, consistent drug use. So then we ask, well, this could be useful for predicting those point uses, maybe for deploying some sort of a tool on a smartphone or something that can help you predict when they're about to use. But another thing that clinicians are interested in is, can we phenotype patients, or can we have an idea of what the potential risk for relapse is, let's say with just a little bit of data at the beginning of a follow-up. And so we can use these other two metrics, where they start off and what their average, let's say, trajectory shape is through time, to see whether we can predict relapse. And that's what we're going to try to do here. Now, people who have studied relapse have posited that impulsivity or impulsive personality might be a risk factor for relapse. And as I told you, in our design, we had this entire battery of personality scales that we used or that we collected at the beginning. And so we really wanted to know whether the discount rate mapped onto any of those personality trait measures. And what we find is that discount rate measures are not correlated with personality measures of impulsivity. Here I'm showing you each subscale is considered a different dimension of impulsivity. So this is urgency, lack of premeditation, lack of perseverance, sensation seeking, lack of attention, motor impulsivity, non-planning impulsivity, and I also have the baseline discount rate and the mean discount rate across sessions. And as you can see, the discount rate seems to be capturing something that is not personality or that is not trait impulsivity. So this warrants the investigation of trying to put everything together in a model and seeing which of these dimensions is actually a relevant predictor or is a significant predictor. And that's what we did using a methodology taken from the machine learning literature, which allows us to select the variables that are relevant because it shrinks to zero the coefficients of covariates that are not contributing significantly to the variance explained. And because what we're predicting here is relapse, we use a logistic regression version of the lasso. And so here I put everything in that model, right? I put around here, you can see the impulsivity personality subscales that I mentioned before. I also added demographic information. I also added some of the symptomatology in terms of addiction, anxiety, and depression, and the baseline discount rate and the slope of the discount rate, right here at the bottom. What I want to show you first is that most of our impulsivity personality trait measures are shrunk to zero, so they're not contributing to the prediction of relapse. And neither is the discount rate in the first session. So a single discount rate is not going to tell you, taken at the, measured at the beginning of treatment, is not going to tell you whether that person is at higher risk of relapse. But the slope is a positive predictor. So measuring a few and seeing where the trajectory is going is a significant predictor. Interestingly, there are other very strong predictors. These have to do with approach behavior or activation towards outcomes and rewards. So it seems like the drive and the reward responsiveness are significant predictors of relapse too. Okay, so we started off thinking that maybe the discount rate fluctuations would be predictive of abstinence or opioid use. And we found that discount rate variability in our opioid use disorder patients is clinically meaningful. It's tracking craving. And the relative increases in discount rate are predictive of imminent opioid use. We also found that the discount rate is less of a trait impulsivity measure and more of a state-dependent valuation computation that is dynamic in time. And that the discount rate trajectories seem to be more useful to the prediction of relapse than those trait impulsivity measures. Okay, so with the last few minutes that I have, I'm going to tell you some work that I've started to do, trying to get to what is the mechanism behind this relative change in impulsivity that we're seeing that is related to relapse. So I told you that first we found that the discount rate variability is kind of time-locked and connected with the changes in craving, and that the relative increase in discount rate is predictive of opioid use. So we posited that perhaps what is happening, the mechanism, might be that craving is modifying the neural representations that are necessary for impulsive decision-making, and that might be leading to opioid use. And to test that hypothesis, we're adding 2 fMRI sessions into our longitudinal follow-up, one early in the follow-up and one later in the follow-up, so that we can do within subject a comparison of where they're moving clinically, how their decision-making is changing, and what their neural correlates look like at each of these 2 time points. But who would have thought that it would be hard to get patients with opioid use disorder to come twice for scanning? So this has actually proven to be quite difficult, and we're still collecting that data. So for today, I'm just going to focus on some preliminary data that I have from this first session with 12 patients. So in this first fMRI session, among other things, they're doing the same intertemporal twist test that they did outside the scanner, inside the scanner. What we're varying here, it's always $5 that they can get today. And what we're varying from trial to trial is the amount of money for the delayed reward and the number of days, but it's very comparable. And I want to walk you through the analysis approach. So we get a time series of choices from their discounting fMRI task. We use those choices and fit a computational model to that data. And we obtain a time series of the model-derived subjective values, which we convolved with the hemodynamic response function to get a subjective value regressor that we can use in a whole brain GLM. And so that gives us the neural correlates of subjective value. So up to here, nothing different from what we would expect. Find activity in ventromedial prefrontal cortex, in striatum, where you would expect subjective value to be represented. So we do this for each of our subjects, within subject, let's say, or for each of our subjects, and then we can use those activation maps and correlate them with different clinical covariates, like for instance, craving. And so that's what we did. There we go. So we took those activation maps and we correlated them with craving across subjects. And what we find is that craving seems to be suppressing the subjective value representation of the delayed outcome in this area of right frontal polar cortex. And this is interesting. So what that means, what I'm showing you here is a negative contrast, right? So I'm showing you the result of that regression that I told you about, and this is the negative contrast. So what that means is that when subjects who are experiencing higher craving have lower activation in this area, that is representing subjective value of the delayed outcome. So that was interesting because this area of right frontal polar cortex has emerged as an area that is relevant for maintaining representations of different goals. And it's actively studied because it could be relevant for this type of problem, right? And if craving is suppressing the goal of waiting, because it's suppressing the subjective value of the delayed outcome, maybe that is explaining the behavior. Similarly, we can do another analysis where we take those activation maps and we correlate them with opioid use. And so we correlated those activation maps with opioid use on the following week, the week right after the scan. And what we find is that subjective value of the delayed reward is weakened in this area of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex when there's higher drug use or more number of positive use days on the following week. And this is quite interesting too because dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is causally related with the discount rate. Studies that have done activations or inactivations in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex have shown that you can modify discounting behavior. So this could also be another piece of the mechanism. So we're still figuring this out, but this is the beginning of trying to get what the neural mechanism behind this phenomenon is. So in conclusion, I told you about an extended model that we refined and that seems to be a better tool for studying discounting, and especially for studying discounting in clinical populations. We found that using that tool, relative changes in the discount rate reflect changes in clinical states and can signal imminent opioid use. And we find that the neural mechanism that is underlying this increase in discounting could be mediated by the effect that craving is having on the representation of subjective value. And in the last minute, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about where we're moving. So first, obviously, we want to finish collecting data for our 2 sessions within subjects so that we can test our hypothesis within the same individual. And another interesting thing that I want to move into is trying to get to a computational explanation of what we're seeing here. And interesting recent work that has come from our lab has shown that craving seems to have a multiplicative effect on subjective value, such that the subjective value for the craved good is enhanced, but also seems to be suppressing or decreasing the subjective value of goods that differ from the craved good. And that sounds a little similar to what we're seeing here, where craving is suppressing the subjective value representation for the delayed outcome, perhaps because it's favoring the subjective value of the immediate outcome. Remember that this is money that they can get today for real, and this is money that they could use to buy drugs. And also this interesting effect that we are seeing of the decreased representation of the subjective value in DLPFC, which is causally related to behavior. And so we want to see whether, similarly, this multiplicative effect on subjective value that we're seeing is actually translated as a divisive effect on the subjective value of the delayed reward. And this is something that we're going to be testing with more data. All right. So I would like to take a few minutes to thank a bunch of people. Obviously, first Paul, because he's been great, and he has almost never said no to me, which is something I've really loved. He welcomes new ideas and new initiatives, and I think if I told him when I joined his lab, or before I joined his lab, when I interviewed and when I asked him to do a rotation, I told him, whatever I do, I want to do it with patience. And I was like, he's going to say no. And he was like, sure, you can do that, whatever you want. So I think that was the indication that I had made a good choice. I want to thank everybody in the lab because we really operate like a family and we all help each other out. And it would take a while to take one person individually and thank them. But I do want to mention Anna, who's right here, because she has been my closest collaborator, my mentor. I've learned a lot from her, and none of the work that I've shown you today I would have finished, or I would have even begun without her. So she has been key to my PhD, and I look forward to more collaboration with her. I also want to thank, through the years we've had a number of students and RAs who have helped us a lot. This was a big endeavor, and there have been a number of people who have been involved at different points, and all great. I want to thank my committee members and Joe. I want to thank John for all his mentorship too, and for his guidance on the clinical side of the project. Our patients and research participants, my CNS fellow grad students, and our DGSS, because I had 2 DGSs during my PhD, the CNS administrators, and my family, who are all here and traveled long distances to see me, and some people who will see me through the camera. So not everybody could make it, but I want to thank them, also my friends, and my sources of funding. And
So we definitely have time for a few questions.
Well, I guess I have one.
yeah.
I was just fascinated, this maybe is something that you guys do all the time, but how did you effectively match for socioeconomic status and everything else,
Yeah.
The opiate users
Yeah.
and non-habitual opiate users?
So I don't have our demographics table here, but I can tell you that most of our patients are very low SES. We have a number of homeless people even, lower education years, and big range of ages and diverse ethnicities, actually quite some Hispanics, some African American, and a lot of whites. So we had to, which is a change from the previous kind of opioid epidemic profile demographically. So we had to work really hard to try to get subjects that would match that. We tried to do it in the same clinic, and that was very hard to find match. We wanted to be as close as the community as possible. So we ended up doing via Craigslist, via flyers and stuff, but we had to do a very thorough screening at the beginning before getting them to, and it's kind of a hard screening to do because you want to make sure that their education level is not too good. So definitely PhD students are not, this is not what I'm showing you here. So that was important, and I think that that's key, and perhaps is behind the fact that our differences between the two groups are kind of smaller than other people have found before. Anything else?
I was wondering about the regression analysis that you're doing, where you're trying to kind of use people's tendencies for discounting temporally in order to predict. You use sort of the current discount rate and then the slope, but did you try using basically just
A running average?
or even just looking at all of the discount rates, say in a recent window, I don't know, let's say the 5 past discount rates, and then just trying to find some sort of weighting between
So
them?
I did do a number of those things, right? I tried the difference from the previous, the difference 2 back, 3 back, right? To try to also get to see whether there's a time lagged kind of like shape. That proved a little bit harder. The issue is that because opioid use can happen anywhere, right, in time, it happens several times. It's very hard to align that so that you can get a nice mapping of that function. The best predictor was this % change from previous. I also tried running average, a number of different things, and this was kind of what worked. Yeah.
I guess going off your answer to that question, do you think that if you could have sort of more fine-grained in time answer, that you could see a smooth shape and see when there's about to be a relapse, not
Certainly.
a relapse, but
So
a
that's
use
another
event?
thing that I definitely want to do, and that we want to do, and it's kind of deploying this in with another type of technology, maybe a handheld device kind of technology that would allow us to get a finer resolution of measurements, not only for the discount rate, but even perhaps for symptomatology and other things. This is kind of the style of ecological momentary assessment studies, and these studies that are, kind of trying to measure all these things several times in the day or several times during the week. And I think that this could really help us try to answer 2 things. One, when is the inflection happen? What's the critical time? And also, what is the shape of that function, right? Like how steep or how fast it goes up.
So, could you just comment on sort of next steps
For
beyond?
that?
Well, beyond the EMA stuff, how do you translate this into an intervention?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to talk about this later. I think that there are 2 things that are interesting here. For one thing, is we have interventions, right? We have social therapy help. So by detecting it alone, we could deploy that, or we could personalize. We could try to, get that person to talk to their counselor at that point, or be connected with a counselor in some way using technology. So that could already help. I mean, there are if we believe that there is a mechanistic relationship between discounting and opioid use, there are things that have shown to change potentially discounting. The framing of the question, for instance, plays a big role, and also there are other neural interventions that seem to affect, like TCS or TMS. So one could think that maybe that would be another intervention. I don't know if we're there yet. I think that the best bet is to have a predictor that can help us deploy the resources we already have. I think that that's more like a more immediate goal.
Okay, thank you all very much.
We
Circle. All right.
Lending her me for a few years.
For a few years. It's okay.
You can
You'll
do
come here.
200-page
Yes,
thesis.
it's fine. We'll figure it out. Yeah.
I mean,
That was you, right?
it's really
No, I found them on the web.
No! They did not exist.
you know, we're just gonna
I love that picture.
It's such a great picture. Oh, you say,
It's in my mom's
okay.
house.
Yeah.
for sure we have a plan that we were
That's yeah, that's from like in your back.
on your phone off.
Yeah,
All right, I think I have to go.
yeah.
So, I'll send an email, you'll be on it.
Great, yeah, we'll
Like
just,
an hour and a half.
we're gonna probably hang out at our place, yeah.
Okay.
No, we definitely have a plan.
Have fun.
And I think it's great, you know, if you know,
Oh,
find out. I mean, she definitely is looking into it. Very well, in like 30 minutes.
30 minutes. It was awesome. Thank you guys. Of course.
You're the first one. Nice to meet you.
Yes.
Be here. Corey? Yeah.
To leave the nest.
I study
I haven't yet. We'll see if they
work
regret.
with Tony Motion.
Anything can happen.
Adam's gonna tell you.
Where is your like follow-up? Here?
No, it's
finished
in,
my PhD
actually, I need
last
to
year, so
move
I've been
to,
doing,
it's in the room right next to the library.
We'll be in Austin.
And you guys are gonna come upstairs?
Yeah.
I'm still here, yeah. I've been doing
I'll see you, we'll guide you
Good
drink,
luck.
but
you like
thank
yourself?
good luck.
Yes, later on, just shoot us all a text.
I will.
Oh my gosh, my postdoc
you,
has
guys.
this amazing apartment that's in
Yes,
Boston.
not yet. Don't jinx it.
Don't wanna mess everything up. But
Don't jinx it.
good job.
Yeah.
All right.
Totally awesome.
The next block,
Thank you.
pretty nice, yeah.
Thanks,
Will
Will.
you,